Today is a day like any other day. Today is business as usual. Today is normal. Until it's not. Then it's a day when seconds make all the difference. When communications and coordinations must be clear and quick. When keeping people from harm, maintaining continuity, and protecting assets hangs in the balance. When shaving seconds could keep employees safer in a natural disaster. Or tens of thousands could be saved every minute by keeping businesses up and running. When more lives are protected when facing an active shooter. When trauma victims can be reached and treated faster. And first responders can organize evacuations better. The Everbridge Critical Event Management Platform delivers organizational resilience on an unprecedented scale, combining real-time monitoring, situational awareness, and integrated response across the enterprise for a common operating view. We hope a day like this never comes. And yet it's a day we prepare for every day at Everbridge. Keeping people safe, assets protected, and businesses running. Returning to normal on a day that turns out to be anything but.
Hello and welcome to the Economist Impact session, Managing Supply Chain Disruptions. I'm Jan Piotrowski, The Economist's business editor, and I will be in charge of today's proceedings. I would like to thank Everbridge for sponsoring this event and making it possible, and to all of you for tuning in, obviously. Now, the topic of discussion is incredibly timely. COVID-19 has tested many critical functions of businesses around the world and put operations in the spotlight. Supply chains have never been in the headlines as much as they have been in the past couple of months. Offices shut overnight, production facilities were disrupted, supply chains were interrupted, businesses had to think on their feet and act incredibly fast to stand up to the first pandemic shock, and now they're facing a second one. Obviously, though a crisis of the magnitude of COVID-19 is unlikely to be a totally regular occurrence, the pandemic has highlighted the mounting threats that businesses face every day. Some of these are related to climate change, others are related to lapses of critical infrastructure. The changing nature of work poses new challenges. For instance, just managing a remote workforce, but also increased exposure to cyber threats. And preparing for these challenges and responding to them will look different across different sectors and in different companies. But all firms should really be looking very carefully at how to tackle them. So over the next hour, we will explore how companies can strengthen operational resilience to uphold business continuity in the face of disruptions, of which the future is likely to hold an awful lot. And to unpack these complex questions, I am delighted to be joined by four excellent panelists. We have Tracy Reinhold, who is the Chief Security Officer of Everbridge, Sarah Black, who is the Financial Services Operational Resilience Lead at Deloitte, Charlie Netherton, Head of Advisory Services and Strategy in the UK and Ireland for Marsh, and Roger Stearns, who is Global Director of Business Continuity and Resilience at Philips. So, as I mentioned, we've had basically two waves of pandemic disruptions, big waves of pandemic disruption over the past 18 months. The first hit the Western world, certainly. I mean, obviously, it started a little bit early in China, in March, April, May of last year. And then the second really came into its own in the past couple of months. And in between, things sort of seem to be working relatively well in terms of supply chain resilience around the world, with some notable exceptions and blips, such as the Ever Given fiasco in the Suez Canal. But I wanted to start by asking Roger about how these two waves of disruptions differed for an operational company like Philips. So, again, how was the first shock different from the second? And were there any lessons learned in the first shock were useful for dealing with what the world is experiencing at the moment?
Well, for us, having a very, resilient operation with business continuity built in about it, so maintaining overhead stocks, um, prioritizing staff all in advance, I think led for a seamless process for us. And I think a lot of our supplier risk management that played a huge piece in this prior to the COVID situation, that it meant a very seamless, it seemed seamless in the first wave, which is much different as we moved through into what we would say is now the second wave. And kind of the first lesson of business continuity is you deal with one disaster at a time. And what we're seeing now with COVID, that we're seeing 2, 3, 4 different things hitting the entire supply chain all at the same time. And a lot of times we're all vying for the exact same resources, the 300 millimeter chipset, very limited suppliers for them around the world. But then throw in, government regulations, the port authorities being backed up. You're seeing multiple instances that you really can't control those more than like you did in the first wave.
It's very interesting, and the fact that you've got this confluence of factors is really very interesting. Sarah, I'd like to turn to you and sort of ask a similar question, but you obviously have a lot of clients who have faced these disruptions, both in the second wave and the first wave, and I was wondering whether the sort of questions and the sort of worries and challenges that they have been coming to you to help them resolve have differed significantly between those two periods.
Yeah, and I think the short answer is yes. A number of our clients are really looking at how they need to modify their operations to make them more resilient, be able to cope with that fluctuation in supply and demand. And there's also the kind of end-to-end supply chain, that different geographies are going through different climate change, different restrictions, different government restrictions, different challenges. And therefore, any organization that has a global footprint really actually has had to adapt, scale, and have a very flexible operating model to enable them to adjust as there's peaks and troughs in activity, both between what we saw at the outset, which kind of occurred over a prolonged period of time, and now, as again, we're seeing various spikes in activity. That supply chain has really been emphasized, and being able to moderate and be adaptable with your supply and demand, and actually a focus on that continuation of services. So the tactical, getting everybody to work remotely, is now very much how do we maintain business and our services with the minimal disruption possible.
So I'd like to ask Charlie now, it's a sort of follow-up question, I suppose, and that is, to what extent is the current chaos, because it sort of sometimes seems extremely chaotic, lots of things happening, lots of sort of disruptions happening at the same time, how much is that a sort of a freak accident, just a freak confluence of events, and as a result, something that you might not expect to be happening all that often in the future? And to what extent was it sort of inevitable because of the way that supply chains are constructed? And as a result, you might expect them, this sort of confluence to occur again and again. So I think that's the sort of, I suppose that's the big question which we're going to be touching on from various angles, but I'd like to pose it maybe quite straightforwardly to begin with.
So to some degree, this current situation has actually been building for quite a long time now. We've been looking to optimize returns over the last 20, 30 years. We've seen companies choose to reduce their redundancy in order to improve profitability. And we've seen that not just at the corporate level, we've also seen it to some degree at the nation state level as well. And so as that's built up, we've been reasonably lucky that other than the financial crisis, we've not had major shocks to the global system in that period of time. And therefore, to some degree, there's been a level of complacency that's built into corporate and to national and international planning. So to that extent, it's maybe not surprising that we've seen, on the back of one big and importantly protracted shock with COVID-19, to some of the points that Roger was making before, you can see how if we'd recovered reasonably quickly from the initial wave, maybe we wouldn't have had the compound effect, but we've not been able to withstand the duration of the shock. And it's built on underlying tensions. So we've had geopolitical tensions between the US and China. We've had Brexit. We've had this sort of corporate search for yield. We've had an ever thinning of supply chain resilience. And so when we've had one shock, it's led to another and led to another and led to third. And it's actually got to the point now where I would assume that very few companies are now, have ever planned for the situation that they now find themselves in, because you're seeing a series of compound shocks. And so unless we really change our attitude to resilience, I think that this is something that we will struggle to really take the lessons on board, unless there is a real shift in focus, until risk and resilience actually becomes, it needs better PR. It needs to be something that's actually really taken seriously in the boardroom and in governments, rather than something that to some degree has felt like we've paid lip service to.
So that's interesting. I mean, I think supply chains are certainly getting more PR than they have ever, presumably, at the moment. But I would like to follow up on one thing that you just said. You said that the world has been lucky to avoid, use the word lucky, to avoid, these sort of concomitant crises of the sort that we're seeing now. And I wonder whether that's luck or whether that's sort of the way that the system was sort of designed. It had a degree of resilience through broad distribution, right? If you can imagine a system, there were a lot of calls early on in the pandemic about, countries need to do more at home, not to rely as much on the global supply chains. But if you think about it, if you had a lot of activity concentrated in particular countries, that would have been incredibly unstable in some countries because they locked down completely. So the only reason they managed to actually survive relatively unscathed economically was because of the fact that they were plugged into global supply chains. I mean, autarky is famously not a very stable system. And there were a lot of calls for what sounded like a more autarkic approach to managing supply chains, both at a company level and at a national level, I think early in the pandemic. And we're hearing them again now. And I wonder to what extent that's slightly misunderstanding the nature of resilience, really. And Tracy, I'd like to come to you with that. How do you think that the understanding of what resilience means has changed over the course of these two shocks, and whether this understanding was sort of one thing after before the first shock, one thing, another thing after the first shock, and then is being reconsidered again now?
So I think that the significance of resilience has been elevated as a result of the pandemic, which by extension has actually better defined resilience. However, I don't think that we're where we need to be yet. I think this elevation has helped the resilience space. The key now is to capitalize on that increased situational awareness as it relates to resilience, and actually take that visibility and be able to reinforce the significance of it. If you think about it, 20 years ago when we started doing just-in-time delivery, right? So Charlie talked about a little bit about, that this has been building for years, and he's absolutely right, where revenue has trumped resilience or risk management. And it's been an evolution. What the pandemic and concurrent crises has done for us as a global economy has demonstrated how fragile that system actually is. It has also reinforced the idea that historically people have looked at resilience purely from a business continuity perspective and not from an enterprise resilience perspective, which is a totally different animal when you think about it. Business continuity is critically important for the sustainability of a company. Enterprise resilience looks at all aspects of the company and how you can maintain that operational tempo that ensures revenue generation and success. So I think what has happened is, to your point, Jan, it has elevated the discussion of resilience to the board level and to the country level. And it's up to us as risk professionals to make sure that that elevation is maintained and that the opportunity to increase enterprise resilience across all enterprises, all different verticals in industry, is actually accelerated so that we can continue to move forward at the right pace. One of the things that we need to be thinking about is an agnostic approach. Let's not concentrate on what we've just solved. Let's expect the unexpected, so to speak, and have a system that allows you to manage risk and resilience from a risk and threat agnostic position, as opposed to planning for a specific event, which then actually makes you more susceptible to another event. So I think it's an evolutionary process, but I think at the end of the day, if there's been any good out of the pandemic, the good has been to elevate the significance and importance of resilience on the global stage.
Can I push you a little bit on that? I mean, actually, maybe not push, but just sort of ask you to flesh out a little bit the difference between what you mean by business continuity and enterprise resilience. Maybe just giving an example of what would constitute a business continuity plan and how that differs from the sort of broader approach to resilience that
Sure.
you have in mind, because it's not entirely clear to me how the two differ.
It's okay. So when you look at business continuity, you're basically looking at three principles: facilities, people, and technology. Historically, that's what we look at from a business continuity perspective. When I talk about enterprise resilience, we also have to factor in things like personal resilience. Does the personal resilience of an employee impact the resilience capabilities of an organization? Are there things that may not be part of the key capabilities, but are also important to the organization to maintain? Part of that is also looking at the culture of a company, what their brand and reputation looks like from the outside looking in. How do you maintain that? And also developing a comprehensive corporate communication strategy that addresses business disruptions and how you articulate what the company's position is going forward. So it's more of a holistic enterprise-wide approach that involves all aspects of the organization, but it also involves your upstream and downstream dependencies. So from a traditional third-party risk perspective that you would look at, you want to make sure that you can be the most resilient organization in the world, but if you have dependencies on companies that are not resilient, how does that impact your sustainability as an organization? So that's where the traditional third-party risk part of an organization comes into play. So putting all of that together into a comprehensive plan that allows you to have flexibility and agility in addressing the unexpected business disruptions and the return from them. You spoke a little bit about cyber. One of the things that cyber does is there's a day zero mitigation that we use when we address cyber issues. A lot of companies suffer, though, when they don't have a holistic enterprise-wide response program to a cyber attack. How are we talking to key stakeholders, to shareholders, to customers, to vendors, so that everybody gets the same message? All of that is part of maintaining an organizationally enterprise-wide resilient posture, so that we can continue to generate revenue, be successful for ourselves, for our customers, for our vendors, for our stakeholders, and our shareholders.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And yes, and this more comprehensive approach is clearly something that the companies probably ought to have on their radar. Roger, I'd like to swivel back to you and ask, You mentioned that basically, Philips has been building its resilience for a while, and so it wasn't necessarily taken aback entirely by the pandemic. I mean, everybody was to an extent, but you stood in pretty good stead.
Yeah.
And I wondered what have you changed? What has there been anything in your approach to resilience that you've changed since the start of the pandemic, since March 2020? Have any processes changed? Has the way that you interact with third parties, as Tracy mentioned, changed? Is there anything new that you're doing, or is basically you were pretty well prepared and you're just hacking away at doing the good things that you were doing before?
Well, of course we were prepared. We were ready to go. No, I think that some things that happened for us were set months and years prior to this particular saying COVID is a one-time event. In that we like many companies were looking at business continuity. We had continuity plans, and that's really about maintaining. And the company was really in a transformation, and we have been for a number of years as we transform into a healthcare company, a health tech company, and that allowed us to entirely change our shift from continuity to resilience. Just as Tracy was mentioning, we have been on a long road that we've set a path, and as well as having that operational resilience built in, taking those silos and bringing them into single tool sets where we're all communicating with each other, working through the third party monitoring, and that was all started. So when it came time for that first wave, we were pretty confident. Other than really getting into understanding some terminologies, what's essential, what's non-essential, and how did that translate for other companies that we dealt with. And I think that we really start to see that come to light now. But I'd also go back to mention that some of the things that that we try to look at is never waste a good disaster as you look to how to improve your process, because you do have a lifespan. 9/11 had a lifespan of where you could do investment, change programs, and even new companies emerged out of that. And I think that we entered into this, and as I said, we had this roadmap, and the actual term that got phrased throughout our organization was the triple duty of care. And that is something that is very ingrained into the Philips organization. And where that is number one is resilience, is number one, customers, employees, that's within our triple duty of care. So I think that, any disaster can help you improve. And I think as we do look at this second wave, that I think there's a lot of things that have to change, because everybody was moving toward thinning that supply chain line to streamline it. And that streamlining brings us to where we're at today, is that we need to kind of maybe widen that the depth of it. And we've done that through engaging with a couple of organizations that we really see end to end, from raw materials to the customer, and partnering and looking at how we mature the supply chain integrity throughout.
Oh, that's very interesting. I mean, obviously, it's also going to incur some costs, right? I mean, the thing about resilience and redundancy, it's basically insurance, and insurance never comes free, right? There's always a cost. So, and it might be a cost just to sacrifice in the sort of efficiencies that you get from really tight supply chains. That's also a cost. I'm wondering, Charlie, I'd like to come back to you and sort of ask you from the financial services perspective, how are companies thinking about those costs? Are those costs painful enough already for them to actually make the investment necessary to avoid those costs in the future? Or are they still, is this jury still out on that calculation?
So it's a good question. My sense is that companies aren't yet, for the most part, thinking about it in the right way, but they have also increased their spending on resilience and looking at risk in a different way for the future. We've seen a lot more activity from companies who maybe didn't engage on the topic in the past, who want to talk about it, want to think about what they could do differently. I think Sarah referenced some of that earlier as well, and we're seeing exactly the same kind of conversations. The reason I say I think they're thinking differently about it is we did some research a couple of years ago now that looked at the response the change in share price in organizations that have faced a crisis and how they come back afterwards. And this was all so normalized against their peers. So you take the overall market move out. We found that organizations that handled a crisis badly ended up trailing their peers by about 12% in their share price over the next 12 months. Those that actually weathered a storm well ended up 5% above their peers. That's 5% above the companies that didn't have any shock whatsoever. And so actually investors reward good resilience. There's a 17 percentage point difference in share price between those that don't weather well and those that do, but that actually you are better off having had a shock and coming out of it well, which of course means you have to have done the work in advance. It's very, very hard to weather that well.
Or you were just really lucky in that you had you had plants in a particular part of the world which was unaffected, right? Did you try and disentangle those? Because I mean, I suspect that there are lots of random variables which might mean that the company didn't actually do a lot, but ended up, withstanding a shock pretty well, just for a variety of random factors. Did you try to control for that?
We did. We looked at about 40 or 50 different companies facing a variety of different shocks over about a 10-year period. We're actually, as you would imagine, in the process of updating our analysis to see how companies have done through the series of COVID crises, although we sort of need to see the world play out a little bit longer in order for that to be really meaningful. And is there an element of luck? Maybe. But investors are also reasonably smart as well, and they can differentiate between those companies that were lucky and those that weren't. So I think there's we talked a little bit about luck earlier, and you made the point around, is it just luck that we've got global supply chains, or is it actually a bit of integrity in the system? I don't think global supply chains are bad. Don't get me wrong. I think that we just need to think a little bit more broadly. It has been the trend towards globalization. I think we need to also understand that there's a balance between global supply chains and local resilience. It's not that one's good and the other's bad. It's that we need to look at, to Tracy's point, the holistic system and actually put it all back together. And companies that do that, companies that plan for that, will be expensive. It isn't a free activity, but if our previous analysis holds through the next set of crises, there's actually a positive return in your share price. You do get paid ultimately for resilience.
That's really, really, really very interesting. I'll be very keen to find out what that analysis shows this time around. So please do keep us posted about that. Sounds fascinating. Sarah, I would like to sort of, Charlie mentioned you mentioning, companies taking a more serious look at resilience among your clients. Where are those investments going? What are these companies doing? Where are they allocating those scarce resources to increase their resilience? And where should they? Where are you telling them to allocate those resources? So where should they be allocating those resources in your mind?
Yeah, and thank you. It's a good question, because at the moment a lot of that work's still being done. So certainly across financial services, we're seeing a real push from the regulator to kind of raise up, as we've already described, operational resilience. And yes, there's absolutely investment required, but a lot of that work that's being done now to identify what's important to the customers, to the stakeholders, enables more of a choice. So where that investment can create the best returns, where that investment can close some of the vulnerabilities that they have within providing that service. And I think, to echo what Charlie and others have said, is actually it is a lot about that mindset change. We're seeing this really be resilience as an outcome, improving the resilience of an organisation. It's assuming failure. So as well as being prepared to prevent, detect, respond, you have to assume failure. And I think what organisations, certainly across financial services, are doing now, as well as a regulatory imperative around this, is actually understanding that building in resilience can then give an increased level of confidence. They're then using it to actually do scenario testing to understand where those vulnerabilities lie, to help inform that investment decision that you mentioned, Jan. So whether that is because there's a vulnerability in technology or there's a vulnerability in people and process. And it is, to echo, as we've all talked about, the holistic end-to-end view. So rather than an inside-in siloed view of resilience, this is taking it across the full value chain, including your third, fourth, fifth third-party suppliers that support providing that service, and being able to demonstrate that you've gone through a certain number of exercises and scenario testing, threat agnostic, as I think we've mentioned as well, but to help support where those investments can give you the best return, close those identified vulnerabilities, and help you demonstrate that you can operate within the tolerance limit that you are setting yourself as an organisation for what is important for your clients and your customers.
What sort of order of magnitude are we talking about when it comes to these investments? I mean, as a share of sales, say, do you have a sense? I mean, is it 1%? Is it 5%? What sort of, what sort of sums are we talking about? What sort of, capital allocation is coming along? Is it material? But that's basically what I'm getting at.
And it's very difficult to answer that because everyone's going to be different. And I don't want to avoid the question, but I think it also means there's advantages from understanding what work you've done already around financial resilience planning, for example, operational continuity and resolution, how much you need to have as a capital liquidity buffer. You can feed that into some of your thinking. But our view is very much, when you look at resilience, you're looking at three kind of pillars, actually. You're looking at financial resilience, operational resilience, as well as reputational resilience, and actually considering it more as a multi-time scale, longer term perspective. So yes, there is going to be a tactical fix needed, quite often system technology related, but actually this is about building this into your operating model. And therefore, depending on how you want to do that, and that goes back to that mindset again, being ready, assuming that failure, and building in the agility to your operating model is a decision really that I think now sits at the board level. And that's why we're seeing really the focus of resilience sitting very much with senior management, with executives and with the board. And it can be, as we've talked about, that competitive advantage. It can give you that customer and regulatory trust. So there are certain benefits with those investments, but it's definitely a longer time horizon than maybe has been seen before.
I was wondering, I would like to do one follow-up on that. And you mentioned, obviously, and Roger mentioned this as well, thinking through, how not just your internal operations, but also your suppliers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So to what extent is there a sort of first mover disadvantage for a large corporate taking care of other links in the supply chain? Because corporates share those other links with other corporates. So if they are allocating their resources to making those other links more resilient, they're potentially free riding rivals that don't have to make that same expense. Is that a calculation that companies are making?
I mean, I think they're pushing for actually increased collaboration across industry, across services that we have not necessarily seen. And we've seen a lot of that coming out of this pandemic, organisations working collaboratively together. to improve the level of service, to provide substitutability of that service, maybe using another organisation's supply chain, infrastructure, communication channel. And we've got history, other events across the financial services sector that have seen that happen. So I do believe this actually provides a bigger opportunity for that collaboration across sectors and across industry and across that supply chain. But that is going to take time.
Roger, I wanted to ask you whether you've sort of noticed some of that collaborative spirit between, nominal competitors in order to overcome the problem that I highlighted earlier.
Well, I'm very fortunate to have worked in a couple of industries, and I spent many years in the financial institutions, and saw that collaboration that was going on amongst several organizations, creating a flow, a process of sharing. And when you step into other, now I'm over in the healthcare side of things, and there isn't that clear transparency in that because it is a competitive advantage in some respects to not reveal some things. But as I mentioned earlier, that we've entered into a partnership with this group, and it is suppliers, providers, hospitals, and we are all collaborating and working toward creating an open environment of where we can share, but yet we can build an end-to-end view of, as I mentioned, from raw materials through the customer, partner, patient at the very end, and having that transparency through to through. And there's a lot of trust that has to happen there, that the things that you could imagine that could go wrong, and being very open like that. But we're trying that, and trying to find the standards that other, our competitors are in the same forum, and we're having the same conversations, trying to answer not only future and current customers, but to increase share through being forthcoming and saying, yes, this event is impactful, or this is how we process this, or this is how we do business continuity for this. And so that they have an understanding, just as we go out and do our own supplier risk management, in turn, the customers want to come back and do the same thing to us, and to say, what have you done? What are you doing? And I think that like the financial industry, I think other industries have to find that same stream of sharing and collaboratively working together, and knowing that it is the global economy forces us to think differently. It's not about being a single border, a single country, a single town, that you have to look across that entire spectrum, because we're all drawing materials from multiple and same vendors in many spaces.
The one sort of little niggle with that, which it all sounds very nice in practice, and one niggle could be regulatory, in that when competitors start collaborating, that sometimes looks a bit like a cartel, and there's obviously a fine line between being collaborative in a global crisis like the pandemic, and then being collaborative in facing down sort of slightly more localized crises, which also affect whole industries. And I do wonder whether regulators are going to take a different view. They've obviously been quite lenient through the pandemic. Certainly in the in the pharmaceutical business and in drug making, there was a lot of collaboration between companies, which I suspect would have been looked upon rather askance by regulators in a non-pandemic setting. So that will be one interesting thing to look out for. Tracy, I'd like to turn to you. We have about 20 minutes left, and I wanted to sort of cast the conversation forward and sort of start wondering about what other big threats companies aren't thinking about at the moment. Everybody's obviously preoccupied with the pandemic and with all the ramifications of that, which have manifested in various ways. But very often, and you alluded to this when you were speaking earlier, very often companies or governments, for that matter, they fight the last war, or they prepare for the last war. It's a sort of the Maginot Line predicament. and and obviously in the way that you understand things, building resilience should prepare companies to withstand any shock. But are there any shocks in particular that you think that companies ought to be thinking about more than they are?
So it is a good question. And of course, if I had the answer to what the next catastrophe was going to be, I'd be a very resilient and wealthy person. But I will tell you this, that the best way to prepare for that is to aggregate and deconflict intelligence. So one of the challenges with maintaining a resilient posture is making sure that you have the appropriate intelligence feeds that actually inform you about emerging threats before they actually manifest. The problems with intelligence is that too much of it becomes white noise. So aggregation without deconfliction doesn't really solve the problem, it just exacerbates it. So putting filters and going through a digital transformation in your organization that allows you to leverage things like AI and machine learning so that you can actually get a better sense of what's emerging on the global crisis landscape allows a company to position itself to be more resilient going forward. One of the challenges with that is that a lot of resilience in an organization is a very manual process. So without leveraging technology, you're putting yourself at a bit of a disadvantage against your competitors. So the idea is that you should be able to aggregate deconflict intelligence for things that matter to you in your core business. So developing a resilient posture without understanding the core business that you're trying to maintain resilience for is actually creating more of a problem than it's solving. So being a student of the business, understanding what's important to the revenue generating sides of the business, and then developing a resilient posture that reinforces that. Part of that is being forward looking and saying, what are the emerging trends and vulnerabilities, whether they're on the dark web, whether they are global economic crises, whether it's weather and climate. All of these things come together to create an environment that is very difficult to operate in. So leveraging technology to keep yourself and your organization informed is one thing. The other part of that is leveraging technology to be able to respond to a business disruption, regardless of what it is. I think it's a dangerous path to go down to say this is what the next crisis is going to be, because that's where people will focus. And they will myopically focus on those things to the exclusion of other possibilities. That in its very definition is not a resilient posture. It's about opening that aperture, looking at all potential vulnerabilities, risks, and dangers, and then figuring out how you can address those without being so tailored towards a specific event that you can't respond to other unexpected issues that manifest. And traditionally and historically, that's exactly what we've done. So now we're looking at global pandemics, or we're looking at ransomware, or we're looking at whatever the latest hot button item is, and not really saying to ourselves, how do we encompass more? We do that through intelligent sources. So disparate sources, bringing those together and finding out really what is happening and what is emerging in the world, and creating an environment where we can respond to business disruptions quickly. And in some cases, actually, depending on how good our intelligence sources are, we can actually mitigate them before they manifest or lessen the impact. That by its very nature is resilience. The other thing that I think that, a little bit off topic, but one of the things that we tend to forget sometimes, and you talked a little bit about cartel or monopoly, transparency is key, right, to avoid that perception. The other thing that resilience gives an organization is a great opportunity to recruit and retain talent. So when Charlie talked about the differences between those that handled it poorly and those that handled it well, one of the other outcomes of that is it attracts talent to an organization that successfully manages a global crisis, because all of a sudden that's where you want to work. You can retain or you can recruit exceptional talent by having a great resilience posture for a company.
Yeah, and I would just add to that when you look at the sheer amount of data that we process on, threat and risk to the organization, and then turn that around and say that I would say that 99% of most, if we say crisis or disaster for an organization, that having that intelligence and knowing what to do about it or with that information is key. So crisis management will solve so many things before they ever get to be an issue for an organization. Having the business continuity plan is important, having crisis management, but I tend to refer a little bit more about the planning spectrum of taking those things that happen locally small, the hazmat situation that develops quickly, that you've got first responders on scene, then you have a crisis management incident, then we're shutting down a part of your building or your facility, so now we're into a business continuity. And then you get to a situation where, let's just say, a tanker spill or something, where you have to evacuate your building and actually shut the power down to your building, where you have a full disaster of shutting down a data center, your operations, and having that ability, but working that crisis management team to have the knowledge of how to respond and pair that against the intelligence that's coming in. And to me, that's where you get that holistic approach to the entire thing.
That's really interesting. We have a few questions from the audience, which I would like to pose to the panel. And the first one, I think this one is maybe for you, Charlie. Does the panel think that short-termism has reduced business resilience, and is there a need to change to statutory or regulatory framework for companies to ensure that there's a more balanced approach to investment and profit making? Is short-termism to blame?
So we talked earlier about the way that companies have been looking to optimize their returns and not necessarily spending on resilience, and in fact removing resilient layers where they've been expensive in the search for returns. That's a form of short-termism, yes. Is the answer more regulation? I think sometimes it can be, but the challenge with regulation is you end up just defining a new set of rules, and that just creates another level of rigidity in the system. And if we've learned anything over the last 2 years, it has to be that rigid systems fail. And what we need to create is an ability to respond creatively. To Roger's point, organizations need to start preparing to respond to multiple simultaneous crises. Crises very rarely happen in a vacuum. Something hits, something else happens. Very hard, though, to actually work out what that's going to look like. And so a lot of the answer is to think creatively about what might come down the line, and to rehearse and plan, but know that what you're rehearsing and planning for isn't the event that you'll actually have to face live. It's getting teams to respond to a variety of different situations, and not just physical shutdown events, which has been where historically so much of our focus has been. So Roger's examples, you need to evacuate the factory. You need to move to a secondary logistics center. These are things that we've planned for, and they're good, right? That helps you build the muscle, but it's not going to get you ready to respond to a prolonged 12, 18, 24 month compound crisis. So we need to encourage that creativity. We need to look at a diversity of different risks and shocks. We need to get management teams that have resilience in their DNA. Does regulation play a role in that? Maybe a little bit, but it doesn't sound like it's the answer to me.
Yeah, I would sort of wholeheartedly agree on that front. I mean, regulations do some of them are absolutely necessary, but they do, as you say, introduce rigidity, which, whereas what resilience is really about, I mean, even the word itself, to resile, right, is to sort of to bend back into its previous shape. So it's all tied up with flexibility rather than rigidity. And Sarah, I have another question here, which I think would be great for you. And this is specifically about banks, so the financial sector. What are the low-hanging fruits to make a bank operationally resilient?
So I'll answer it two ways. I think the opportunity at the moment is to break down some of the silos that have existed in the past. I think a lot of what actually the regulation is trying to do, founded on kind of a few years really of what's come out of the regulatory agenda, most certainly in the UK, but we're seeing Europe and globally kind of moving in this direction, is approach this from your customer's lens. So I mentioned kind of resilience as an outcome. So for me, it's breaking down those silos. That should be relatively easy. It's bringing together the connectivity across an organization to understand what is really important to your customers, to your stakeholders. And in doing so, I think there's an opportunity there to really see where you may have some of those vulnerabilities. And again, they may be some of the low-hanging fruits. Can you cross-train teams to help in the event of disruption? So you've got people available if you need to kind of have some of that redundancy. Is there substitutability in how you deliver that service? Do you have any of that redundancy already within your ecosystem? And so there's some easy aspects of resilience that can be considered upfront. There is very much a regulatory drive across the banking sector, and there is actually quite a short timescale by which to have done some of this initial thinking. I think the longer term thinking comes with, and once you've got that low hanging fruit, where are my strategic choices? Where do I really need to put my investment? How do I really embed that DNA culture that Charlie mentioned? And that is the agility, it's the mindset shift. And I would just echo what Roger was saying earlier, by actually, and Tracy, being able to test and demonstrate that you've done that testing and stress the scenario will also help you identify what's really important and where that investment can go. And I think a number of banks and organisations are looking at how they can stress test the important business services that they've defined and therefore help them really understand where they need to make those investment decisions for the long term and close some of those vulnerabilities that they're noting within that infrastructure.
Yeah, I wonder, so just one follow-up from me on that. Are there any sort of off-the-shelf tools for stress testing, or is this all really complicated and has to be tailor-made to a particular institution? Is there sort of, I mean, you obviously probably help companies do some of this, but is there an industry popping up to help with these stress tests that companies of all shapes and sizes could approach for help?
So there will be. We're seeing an evolution here. I think the importance actually is that being able to demonstrate what you're doing on the journey around stress testing. I think what we will see is the sophistication of that modelling and using technology such as digital twin, for example, which previously has helped demonstrate where you can gain efficiencies. You can use very simple modelling to say, well, what happens if I take out that system, or if I take out that process, or if I have a data leakage? If I put in additional communication, does that lessen the impact? If I have a backup recovery plan, does it mean I can substitute over to a different site? So I do think there is tooling. There will be future development around tooling. And I think the real excitement is how you actually get some of the sophistication in the modelling of that stress testing that I mentioned.
That's very interesting. But part of that modelling, and this is coming on to another question from the audience, which I'd like to pose to Roger, is about dealing with, because we've been talking a lot and sort of mostly implicitly about the supply side and disruptions to the supply side of the equation. But what COVID has shown is that there can be a lot of disruption to the demand side as well. COVID has introduced incredible demand volatility for various products. And so one of the questions which I would like Roger to tackle is how to prepare for demand volatility of the sort that we've seen. Is that possible? Or can companies really only ever hope to be prepared for the supply side shocks?
Well, it seems like a baited question. I mean, during the first phases of COVID, Philips is a large manufacturer of respirators, and that became a key element for us throughout. And to your question, we ramped up to 300%, but we were also fortified by the DPA. So with the defense, when the Defense Act was declared, other industries started feeding us parts that we would not normally been able to have sourced as quickly as we did. So yes, I mean, we do have factories where we can produce a similar same product in multiple locations, but that does sacrifice other lines. And so having that ability is just something that we just happen to have because of several different types of products, similar products that we can actually shift and move. But by having this certified, within the healthcare industry, all of our parts and everything have to be certified and proven by the FDA. So there's a long testing and certification process that goes into any single product. So once we have that, then we can lock that in and we know where to source and get supply. So a little extra information in there, but yeah, I think that many companies do have the ability to ramp up. But the one thing that COVID, the first phase of COVID did for us is that we were able to identify critical employees and hire employees to do that. There were some technicalities that came along with that as far as, the safety of employees and getting employees in, but that wasn't an issue. We were able to move employees around to accommodate the upswing in activity. But as we move into these newer phases, we're now challenged with different pieces. The mandates, I think, are going to, in the next couple of months, are going to really impact or could be very impactful to the supply chain. With some of the numbers that I've been seeing, that it looks like it could be really pushing an already pushed to the edge capability.
Are you talking about the vaccine mandates, or?
Yeah, the vaccine mandates. Between first responders and critical sources, as we're seeing in the ports, with companies, following the mandates, and it's not something that's isolated to the United States. We're seeing it in Australia. Just the large scale protests about the mandates, and then employees are looking to, okay, then I'll go. And so what does that look like for many companies? Is that 5, 10, 15, 20% of your workforce are going to be gone on January 4th? And how do you recover from that? Can you recover that many employees over the next 2 months and have them trained and ready to go to fill those vacancies or potential vacancies?
Yeah, it will be an incredibly interesting test, if it survives all the legal challenges which are mounting against it. Tracy, I'd like to finish with you. We only have 3 minutes left, but I was sort of wondering whether you think that if companies do sort of take on board everything that you've been saying and that other panelists have been saying about, really weaving resilience throughout the operation of a company, rather than just be, just a simple, straightforward, having a simple, straightforward business continuity plan. Whether, if that happens, will that mean that basically the sort of supply chains that we have at the moment can remain pretty much as they are, because companies will be better prepared to absorb the shocks to the system? Or whether you think that adopting this approach would necessarily engender a reconfiguration of supply chains?
So I want to sort of harken back to something that Charlie said earlier, and that is the optimization of revenue. One of the challenges with enterprise resilience is making sure that you can build a business case that resonates with the revenue generating part of the company. if it becomes relevant to them in a sustainability process, then it will be adopted. So resilience is a little bit like security. Nobody likes to talk about it and nobody likes to spend money on it. So in order to overcome that, you have to be able to articulate your position in terms that resonates with the core business. If you purely speak resilience, your senior leadership will tune you out because it's not relevant to them. And humans and companies have very short memories. When things get better, they will stop prioritizing resilience. Our responsibility is to make sure that it does become part of the fabric of the organization and it resonates at the board and at the C-suite level. If you don't do that, regardless of what we do in the short term, it will not be adopted as part of the company culture. So building your business case, understanding the economics of the company, and finding out how resilience enhances that economic position is really how you maintain a resilient posture for the duration of the company's existence. If we look at it from a short-term perspective, we will get short-term results. If we build it as part of the fabric, it becomes organic to the organization and it becomes part of the company. And I think that's the opportunity that we have now with the pandemic. I'm actually very excited about this because for the first time it's been elevated to the discussion level at the board. Let's not lose that momentum by having a short-term approach. Let's look long-term, figure out how we articulate business, and figure out how we get this done for the betterment of our employees and our organizations.
Well, that's a very wonderful and practical piece of advice to end with. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'm sure we could go on for a lot longer. This is a fascinating and topical subject. I would like to thank you all for participating and for your insights. I would like to thank Everbridge for sponsoring the event. And I would like to thank all of you listening for tuning in. Thank you very much.